Hello everyone, a follow-up on the last video about the channel and essentially introducing a little bit the new subscribers and updating also the old ones, the aficionados, let's say, on the broader picture that Schwerpunkt is meant to cover, at least has come to cover over time, on a topic that is surely controversial, right? Most of you probably do not follow me because they're specifically interested, let's say, in politics, or at least they don't search for a lot of this on my channel. And I think you've come to the right place. If by politics we definitely mean factionalism, propaganda, but kind of to pushed ideologies. Of course, you know that as everybody, I'm biased, right? I have no problem to admit it because there is no person in the world that is not biased, first of all, but also because I realize that by acknowledging it, I can give a better proof that objectively I maintain a kind of moderate approach that is probably actually one of the most important reasons why you follow me, because I don't impose you my thinking, my beliefs. I must say I've come to a point of my life in which I have been challenged, not much in political ideas, but in certain levels of moral, behavioral, sentimental ones. And to me, this whole work has always been about that, right? Schwerpunkt can be a kind of a disclosuring channel about historical topics and a broader take on up to existential matters, right? When we studied Kriege, for example, we at the end of the day, we talk about war, we talk about a human experience. I'm planning to, from some time now, to even introduce in the content a history of philosophy series that I think it would be fascinating, especially coupled with maybe also the introduction of modern contemporary history videos. So these are all things that I will be thinking now. Have basically another couple of months before I get rid of my major work now in real life. I mean, and therefore I'll also think through by that time I count on having arrived to 1,000 videos. So at that point we'll have a major reflection and also thank, of course, because of all support you've given me. And I'm making these videos now. I must tell you, these days I'm going through certain specific things that make me more prone to reflect, to speculate. Usually I use this every trip video. I make one about von Clausewitz, and it's like an interludium because I don't have to prepare much content, especially pictures. Yeah, they take a lot of time just to search to find. Preparing the information is really not that difficult. Because I've made so many videos now, I know how to make it, right? Some of you say, how does he do it? You joke about it. Actually, it cracks me every time. He doesn't sleep. I actually do sleep, barely, but I do. But not because I lack time because of Schwerpunkt. Actually, I wish I had much more time for other things that Schwerpunkt has, however, helped me to cope with, right? I couldn't say I'm satisfied, for example, about my current work in real life if I hadn't covered certain things on Schwerpunkt and so on. So, as you understand, this channel is kind of I don't think it's properly a big deal for me in the sense that I'm glued to to the screen, the statistics, thinking what video to do next. It's become kind of a hobby, let's say, or something more probably, and probably it's just if I missed it that I would start thinking it was a big deal, because objectively I've accomplished for myself something that made a difference in my life. To some of you it has made a difference. I've received beautiful messages and even gifts and help, and you have been all in various degrees very helpful to me, though, because you have made me understand a lot of things about the world in general, about how of course I can do better, but especially you transmit a lot of positive interest for history. That is something that really fuels my motivation, and it's probably the most important thing for all the reasons we discuss on this channel. And you may wonder at this point, why do I feel the need to address topics like politics? Well, because over time I changed a bit my mind about the relation that the channel should have with this specific topic. Not because it will increase its political content, because objectively it has never done it, openly or formally. Let's say I'd never done something like that, made a propaganda video about stuff. When I say I'm biased, I throw maybe some perspective in, but I always present it as my personal opinion. And I see that some of you, you come from a pretty varied background in this regard, and this has not created problems fundamentally, which is also something that makes me glad, because that is the positive bias that helps just to have a dialogue and a different perspective, and not an unsolvable conflict, right, or something that is just wall against wall. So the reason why I do this is just is kind of making people sensitive about the, I would say, individual responsibility in a sense that is, sounds quite moralistic in practice, and politics is a field that disturbs a bit people when we think about history. I mean, think about, I don't know, disclosures or entertainers out there that work with history in a way on social networks, on entertainment, business and so on. History is used and abused, we can't say, many times. We all have a historical opinion, and this opinion comes to be, of course, biased, and it is political at the end of the day. I mean, as I often say, everything is political, even what kind of brand of cookies you buy at the supermarket, which is personally I never do, but I don't know, I want to throw some example that could be fitting. That is, every single choice we make, therefore every single word we state, every sentence, every position we take, has a political weight, whether we want it or not. Even remaining silent has a political weight, because it makes the difference really between something happening and not happening. This is let's say, an important acknowledgement, I believe, for a mature person. That is to say, when I talk often to a young audience, which actually is more or less my age, and there are younger people, and those are the ones I feel the most for, because since I've been ahead, I'm not saying that I'm necessarily more mature than them, because maybe on average it is true, but for biological reasons and things I've gone through. But technically, I wouldn't like to give to lead them astray, or to say something that can give a wrong impression. And this may happen at so many levels. I mean, I realize, for example, from the contents that many of you actually comes here for essentially, we could say national reasons. We could say, I don't even say nationalistic or ethnical and so on, but there is an enormous difference between the contents I make, for example, relatively to certain peoples or cultures specifically, and broader technical, even technological or philosophical, politically theoretical contents I make, right? It's pretty evident. Even a random topic about medieval societies is less impacting sometimes than on average, at least. There are also other reasons. Some of you are probably video games players, and or you have received maybe an input to look at the Middle Ages through a certain filter. There are some of you say that need my content because of making researches about creating I don't know, not really fantasy worlds, but even properly actually historical ones to give data of how, I don't know, medieval cities were. That sounds kind of, there's a pattern in there that I have seen through the years, through certain specific interests, through gaming, through other, I don't know, because I've never actually been in those things, but sometimes I say maybe my content is not exactly like that, but I do realize that when I talk about war, right? And war here is the link, the connection specifically, because as Clausewitzins, which maybe we're not all are, but given that this channel is entitled to one of the major, one of the prominent Clausewitzian theoretical concepts of the one of Schwerpunkt, I presume that at the end of the day, also thanks to the von Krieger series, you will get more acquainted to this line of thinking and starting wondering what this is all about, right? This is not just a random guy talking about history for no reason. There's a structure behind that, and many of you are, of course, aware of this. Even though I see that, of course, the von Krieger videos are obviously lagging behind in terms of views and so on, because by default you say, well, what's this thing? I don't care. I want knights, I want wars, I want tactics, this stuff. Yes, but and I do understand it, and I think it's fine, honestly, because first of all, I don't impose you. In fact, my content in the measure of if you don't listen to that, I will not talk about other stuff. But it's evident that I come across that there are important intersections anyway, right? And this must be clear, right? It's something I care really much about. That is to say, doesn't matter where most, because even presumably this video won't be, at this point, I get most of my views from YouTube search, right? So most of you presumably came from the outer world, randomly came across my content for some exquisitely historically colored reason, and then maybe eventually just later, as a subscriber gets, or a regular follower gets acquainted with these other thoughts. So every video I make now, just from in the next few days, makes a few hundred views, and not more. But there are lots that are even bad videos, telling the truth, that still keep attracting. And I leave them out there. Probably I should add some explanatory note as well, because maybe the content or even the way I delivered was particularly good. Like, it's been 3 years now. I've been around, albeit almost 3 years. I began to make videos regularly every day, and I made so many at this point, but just very few keep being watched, and over time they're always the same. Like, there's not much of a variation on the theme there, and so probably at some point the channel will kind of saturate. I mean, this net will be will be thickened. There will be more traffic. So in the last month I got 300 subscribers. I mean, it's not much, but compared to previous times, there is a substantial acceleration that has never stopped. So were this to continue in time, maybe even just with the same speed that has accelerated, however, specifically, we will get somewhere. That is not my main concern, telling the truth. I just like making the videos, but my main concern, as I was saying today, is realizing the political value that everything what we say. How do we do it? Like, first of all, because this is the question that some of you may ask, when you come across a channel, start saying, especially historical content, we all know is kind of political. Like, most of your historical interests, I understand it, right? History is beautiful because you can, through the interests of a person, historical interests of a person, you can quite easily understand what's the political culture of that person at the same time. And I do see that even some of you probably detach the two things. That is to say, this is no political channel, but just a historical one. You're automatically telling something about your political culture, right? And the fascinating thing here is that I began Schwerpunkt more or less with that same idea, right? With the wish to make this channel as unbiased as I could. And it turned out that the more, politically speaking, right, and the more I went on, the more I realized the importance of politics in the content I make. And the more I realized how more politically biased I was at the beginning of Schwerpunkt, right? And why now I feel the need to point this stuff out. First of all, political bias is obvious because it's a behavioral, evolutionistic matter, right? The least you know, the less you know about the world, let's say, the more you are prone to interpret it through some pretty simple patterns. That is to say, black or white, right or left. There is that stereotypical block, right, that you're either from one side or the other, and it doesn't change much. And that's a simplistic idea. It's not even totally wrong, right? We know that humans tend politically, socially to organize themselves alongside that pattern. It's functional to the same survival of society, in the sense that if it wasn't this balance, if there wasn't this inner conflictuality that simplifies itself, that makes it more, because humans are tendentially simple-minded, right? We found out through our intelligence that we can boost our intelligence, we can educate ourselves, we can stimulate our brain, we can structure our intelligence, we can essentially become more efficient and effective through our thinking. This is something that can't be achieved objectively without conflict, right? And this is very connected, as you understand, through also our Clausewitzian theory, because of the obvious realization that whenever we come across with anything in life, we react to it, right? And most of the political thinking of those who do not have the means, just the maturity, let's say, to address complex realities, is to react, to assume even properly a reactionary attitude to it. It's fascinating because there are many of you, there are even very good followers, telling the truth, that very factionated and so on, to me what I do and so on. But you have specifically an ideology. It can be everything. It doesn't necessarily have to be political, but let's say, as we were saying before, everything is political. Can be political, can be religious, can be national, can be, or non-religious maybe, or anti-national. I mean, all in the opposite of everything. That keep following me, and this is the interesting thing. It maybe doesn't have much to do with today's content, but strikes me in a sense. That is, even though I make content that is evidently not into that specific vision of the world or interpretation, believe me, because I'm biased as well, right? So, and very often I'm not. Now I make that example, immediately you think, now I am from one side or another. Really not. It may surprise you what I actually. I came up pretty openly with the fact that I'm tendentially conservative, right? But I even just in interest of time, I assumed much more moderate positions towards the center, but not because of a lack of belief or animosity or passion or what I believe. Quite on the contrary, I had my pattern there. And yet you still keep pushing for that. I don't know if we would comment for that ideology, right? And I don't know if it is for the sake of propaganda. It is to say, you think, if I make these comments, then people will, on this channel, the people who follow the channel will follow me as well, and I will spread these ideas, so my side will become more fun. There is several of you has done this consistently, and was always been positive toward my content. I repeated, even though I had nothing to do with that, or I don't know if some may have misinterpreted my content, may have liked to believe that I'm actually from one side or the other, I have that specific position. I don't know. It may even be a misunderstanding objectively, because I tend to never misunderstand people's intelligence, right? Because to feel like you understand everything is pretty silly, right? But at the same time, when you're exposed to so much data. This I could derive. It doesn't come just through the YouTube experience for me. I see it every day at different levels where people, in very large quantities, right, very large numbers. I actually communicate with a lot of people, even if randomly and sometimes very briefly, and there is a pattern of interpretation, right, including the one on these political issues. So the question is Schwerpunkt political, first of all? Well, of course, right? Like everybody, we said it before. And then what is political like, right? What does he believe in? This is not greatly important, right? I could tell you, yes, that conservative bias is there. There are reasons why I know I'm biased, right? It's normal to be biased. I mean, literally, there are even certain biological patterns for which, certain characteristics why, for example, people tend more towards conservatism, towards liberalism. It's even written in genes sometimes. It's not just, it's mostly life experience, of course, but the attitude, certain core, tendencies, orientations, that sometimes are there just because of your personality, right? For example, I'm not a very compassionate person, right? I'm very empathetic sometimes and kind of even sensitive. I mean, I don't know, during exams, those things, anxious people flock to me. I don't know why, because they say that I'm cold-blooded, that they give, they feel calmer with me. It's something that dates back since I was a child, right? The most, emotional people tended to stick around me because I was kind of a point of reference. I was once my professors, my classmates said, he's so cold-blooded, he could be a sniper if he had a firm hand, right? All this stuff. But I'm really not like that. I mean, you see that I'm pretty expansive at the same time. I'm very sensitive myself, telling you the truth. I'm mostly a sentimental person at the end of the day. But yes, I mean, maybe even for this reason, when there is something, my personal, my intimate self, if you want, is a sensitive person, but my social self is harsher. This has created problems to me, even relationally speaking. It's mild ones, but some even not so mild, because I'm fundamentally I'm not very tolerant at all. I believed fundamentally in core individual values. The closest I could be described to, even though I don't like isms, is to be an individualist in many ways. I believe in free market, but even in here with the moderate, I'm always in between. I mean, history has taught me that there can't be, you can radically push towards one direction. That is to say, an extremistic vote is surely heavier in a political spectrum, but it also has more unpredictable consequences for just being out there. But that, if you want to solve problems rationally, intelligently, you have always to see both perspectives and make a very pragmatic call, if you want. And in fact, emotional, let's say, choice to scientifically calculate what is the best thing at the moment. It is not so immediate. That is, if I had chosen to be a political commentator, as sometimes I followed in my life, but remaining dissatisfied because when I got to the point where I realized that the tendency towards that side was excessive sometimes. It was too, I wouldn't say dogmatic, but let's say too inflexible in a sense. Doesn't take away the fact that I may agree, for example, with certain positions, that I have strong opinions, but that when we face reality, we have to be real about the fact that even though we have those opinions, those are not necessarily going to work, and not because there is one true great reason for doing that. There is a truth, as I always told you. I believe there is a truth. I believe there is therefore some, the best choice. Right, but I don't believe absolutely that humans are capable of understanding it. I believe they can get closer to it, and that there are various ways, various paths. Right, so already these vision of the world to me shows you how, I can't be political in the specific, meaning of in the colored, let's say, meaning of the term, because once again, I can be biased, but I rationalize on the fact that my content shouldn't be about that. It should be about what I was taught to do, at least historically, that is to find the most spot on, the most accurate depiction of what we're understanding. It's a cognitive problem. I must say that my content, I don't know, it's also being influenced by von Clausewitz's idealism. Back in the day, I was much more of a structuralist person. Even that's fascinating because, as you know, that also has some, if you want, more actually left-wing orientation. And it's not surprising that I was much more right-wing at the time, and that reveals what I've been constantly discovering and accepting, in this fact that, you know, the more you get extremistic and the more you get fundamentally impositive and, if you want, more socialistic in the ism, therefore negative sense of the term, but even on that ground, I'm balanced. I would never call myself a socialist, indeed. But, you know, if you ask me, you know, just look at countries in the world. There's no country that couldn't be defined with, you know, some kind of social measure. There, you know, what's your measure of judgment of what is like a socialist thing or not? I mean, you know, by European standards, even our language changes a big deal, right? In the classical political, you know, ideas, you know, a liberal is technically a right winger, because it's for a freer market, right? And you know, and you know, from an anarchism perspective, at least from a sort of conservative sense, you know, you would think certain policies that have been asked to be implemented in the United States, however, is a dramatically different system from Europe, and that therefore the parameters there change would make basically any European country socialist in a sense. But even in there, you have to be consistent about the fact of how do you rule certain countries, especially in countries that are also very different in their own, and how do you cope with the fact that there are people who have ideas that are different than yours, right? This is probably one of the core concepts out there that you have, especially to be careful when you study history, because history always presents you with these problems. That is to say, you know, we tend, first of all, to make rational sense out of history. Like, our linear chronological way of teaching history, of studying history, is unavoidably loaded theological character. That is, you know, there was objectively something that had to come to make it come to that point in history, right? And was one side was fundamentally right or had, you know, the best, you know, they had the upper hand, and you know, the other that lost, it declined. But that's very sharply cast vision of politics and society. The truth being always, they're an extremely fluid situation where there is a dramatic amount of intersections, and also fundamentally a difficulty in defining so categorically. There is enormous space in here, even basically at the limit of philosophy, that I don't even appreciate much in its conclusions. That is substantially the idea that, you know, that simply even the linguistical categories, concepts, you know, the conceptual patterns that we have been used to describe history now are wrong, right? It's not it's a powerful, also political, of course, in its content, but it's properly. I mean, probably is right. You know, what is the words we use, right? How do they make sense? How can they conceptualize, categorize? Well, this is, at the end of the day, how our mind works, even if we were told to do differently. That is, you know, given our level of education at this point on average, well, we go by approximations in everything we say. And of course, there is always room for improvement. And these ideas sometimes get so radical as saying, you know, you can't even speak fundamentally. We don't have to go back to Wittgenstein or to analytical philosophy to find a, you know, the obvious realization that yes, if we were to describe the world, the best thing would be a mathematical language, but it can't be like that. And this is an important lesson because, of course, it shows you that in history we come to those compromises all the time. And so it is from a political point of view. That is to say, politics is not about enforcing your own point of view on someone else. It's properly finding a a concrete solution by negotiations, right? It's like democracy, right? Direct democracy, fortunately, thank God, has never existed, right? Because you can't negotiate. It's something disastrous. It's a dictatorship of the people. It would never. It doesn't work factually, right? And that's also another historical acknowledgement. And this capacity of negotiation is intrinsically a struggle, a conflict, but it also entails a dialogue and therefore an improvement, development, and therefore civilization. I mean, if you wonder whether there are other philosophies that say, for example, that it's completely random at this point that we have achieved so much in terms of political and social development, of quality of life. Yes, it is random. That is, if you were to look at history from just all the things that could happen to make it go not the way it's gone, yeah, we could have at this point be either all extinct or dramatically more advanced or whatever. But the point is that there is a tendency as well, right? It's not just a physical system where you can see just random factor, single variables you could ideally calculate. This is impossible, right? History doesn't work like that. History as a research, it's about understanding fundamentally humanity and understanding each other perspective, because otherwise, without that, you wouldn't be able to read a source, you wouldn't be able to frame it in its context, you wouldn't know what to do with that. You would just instrumentalize, weaponize it in ways that, in fact, were not. And for a long time, history has been something like that. When history was biased by definition, right? There is, there's specific time in history when you know that everything you read is not meant to make sense of reality, but just to blame, to have an agenda at least. Some. Here we are also pretty lucky to be Westerners in terms of historiographical tradition. That is to say, since Herodotus, Thucydides, Xenophon, we have our pretty objective, critical aim, at least, right? It doesn't mean that those sources were we're not biased, but it's very different from how other areas of the world thought the world like. Right, and we have to thank history of thought, and that's why I would like even just to introduce a history of philosophy series in here, has shaped our capacity to solve problems at the end of the day. Through that, it's a matter of survival, right? Politics is substantially facing these challenges every day, right? We know, I presume we live in a world where politics is rising on the fore as a specific culture that for some of reasons in very last decades has somewhat sunk in popularity just as a term, right? When you think about politics, even just the name to our mind sounds like something with at least a slightly negative bias, right? It's the idea of the corruption, the dirtiness, the unscrupulousness, the interested way of course it's valid as a description as long as you add a lot of other aspects to it, because politics is in itself is what you do about it. It's not something that is defined like even just those who make him as a sort of a case, and so it happens, right? But it's fluid, and that's what people have difficulty to realize at this point, that historically speaking, just fixed ideas have never worked. That is, even totalitarianisms, dictatorships, have never held people's thoughts for a long time. That's something you can't properly achieve, right? It's mostly the person's mind that wants to be seduced, that wants to be, subjected to that kind of thinking and to keep behaving like that. And believe me, this is not about extreme realities. It is exactly what we see in everyday life, right? The average person you can meet on the street is a person that has fundamentally a bunch of, kind of core, untouchable, or at least, deeply rooted convictions that derive from essentially a summary, approximate understanding of reality through an average education, a poor information usually, and it goes like that up to death, right? And it doesn't accomplish a great deal in terms of, you know, problem solving out there, contributes to fuel the usual, you know, shouting and anger that revolves around politics, makes it heathen and pushes it in a way that's also functional to this world, right? It's not just, but of course, you know, a person with a bit more insight and kind of, you know, understanding would be able surely to do better for himself, for others, right? Which always go in parallel, exactly to this dynamic. That's why politics has such a heavy weight. That's why history is unavoidably connected to the struggle of understanding constantly a different point of view. That's what you have to learn in history. That is, you can't a mechanistic attitude, right? Even when you talk about war, that to some sounds kind of more kind of easier to understand, because it's as if they could isolate it from the rest, right? Which is a very serious mistake. And in fact, a person who reasons like that is not even properly a military historian, right? It's just, you know, fascinated by war, because let's be honest, who is not fascinated by war? It doesn't matter how terrible it is, and you know, it's not just for this that we have dedicated a channel to it here, but it's because there is a lot you can't wrap your mind around. I mean, it's so vast and complex. It's probably the widest of social sciences, and it has very peculiar, very independent logics and fields of, you know, and methods, right? But there is this tendency, it's as if, you know, what is the best option? What is, I don't know. The most typical thing is, not speaking of, you know, what kind of weapon is better to win a battle, right? Which doesn't make sense, doesn't even make sense as a question, but, you know, what was meant to happen, or what was the thing that would have changed the thing from one thing to another. These are legitimate historical questions, in as much as, of course, reality, as we were saying before, has a core truth. But what we reflect on Schwerpunkt is that fundamentally we don't have a clear, satisfactory mean by any scientific standard in our civilization to figure that out clearly, but through approximation, right, and historical inquiry in that sense. That is to say, essentially studying history, I mean, single episodes in detail and over again, and beginning to understand there's a pattern out there. This is how the saying Vom Krieg is being written, right? We've seen how crucial the experience of command and of military history, that at the end of the day are the same thing, you know, in different ways, but still dealing with cognitively with reality, right, and trying to figure out how it went, right. Participating to a battle or to a war has basically nothing to do, virtually, with understanding anything about it. The same goes for people living in the world, right. It's not that, I don't know, if this is sad news for everybody, but a certain margin, but that's what I say all the time. Being born in a country, for example, whatever that country means in practice, has a very few to do with even coming remotely close to have a minimal, decent understanding of its history. Like, you know, in other words, being born in an age, in a place, has nothing to do with understanding anything about it if you don't start working very hard to do it, and not just reading a bunch of idiocies of, you know, surfing the net or watching some documentary. That's not history. That's not history from an existential point of view, not from a historical, you know, academic, university one. This is probably the hardest realization for many. To me, I had gone far beyond that since an early age, I would say. What I hadn't realized, acknowledged, because at the end of the day, it's not just a matter of knowing that there is the option of thinking otherwise. It's that you probably don't understand another point of view, and therefore you get satisfied about just staying stuck to that. Is that every historical content is political by definition? That you can't properly distinguish a historical statement from a political one. This is connected, in fact, with the previous topic. That is to say, let's be honest. Why do we care so much about national histories, right? Where we know that history is simply beyond that at so many levels that to make anything to be put in relative terms. You see, this is also a political statement, but it is not on Schwerpunkt in the sense, fuck national perspectives, because personally I like them, right? But I also like other ones. I'm not a nationalist. That's also most what people believe, because maybe I make some content that is, I don't know, nationalism is more connected with war in general, with this sense of political unity that also the national, I mean, the state building, for example, of a country entail. I mean, we've seen this dramatically. War catalyzes dramatically the development of organized societies, of states, of specific identities. Yes, but that's political. That is to say, what you believe you're part of. A nation, what is a nation, right? Is it what color you are, what language you speak? It's fundamentally about the political commitment in a unitary sense, right? Once you lack that, it's difficult to be speaking of a nation. This is, I think, a very relevant topic today, because we're living still in the age of nation state. Right, even if certain people don't like to think like that, it is so, and you should understand what it's like that. So that you see, also another a hit also to the other perspective here. But things are changing, right? I would say incidentally that the Middle Ages are perhaps the best period to confrontate with the current historical reality, because they are essentially a world without a state. That's actually a civilization without a state, which is something that I've met actually modernists, contemporaneous. They remain amazed by the fact that humans can work effectively, even create a state, even if they don't have a state, right? This is I, for example, give it for granted, because it's what I see every day in what I study. But the question is, do other people see like that? We're given too much for granted, right? Never give for granted. People may actually lack important chunks of knowledge as much as you can lack that. This goes, I could even quote you some interesting anecdotes I had here. They're talking about World War II with contemporaries that, remain amazed by even banal concepts that I'm not a contemporaneous, definitely not even expert about World War II, even if, I have legitimately, amateurly read a lot about it, and I would like to comment at some point, where, say, okay, and I derived it from medieval history, methodologically, critically, right? And I would say there are too many digressions to open. I mean, for example, the sinking quality of the academies of universities. I mean, I've talked with professors here that can witness, as I could, even in my own country and other countries, but we're talking about major countries here, like, I don't know, Germany, France, Britain, Italy, but young students can't even speak their language anymore, right? They don't know, I don't know, they can't speak subjunctive. They can't actually decline names in their own language, the language of being raised in. And I don't know, medievalists, PhD medievalists sometimes are people who can't translate Latin. The question is, how can you be a medievalist, right? Unless you study, but not even, because even if you studied areas where there's not written, even still, those are described in Europe by countries that were literate, that wrote in Latin. You must know that. If you don't know that, well, what are you going to do? What is history becoming, fundamentally? But don't start me on the sinking quality of call for papers and all this stuff. This is not just a deep problem in terms of, we're going downhill. Actually, we're expanding. The problem is that we are lacking now new tools to frame all the new stuff we are absorbing, because this lack, even in apparent lack in education, is being compensated from another side, from the exposure to an enormous amount of other information. When I was a kid, we wouldn't even think there was so much to know out there. Today we know, and part of the reason why we get distracted compared to the more traditional ways of learning, that are not all bad, but also could be fixed for sure in some ways, and even there we lack a consistent amount of balance, is how do we prioritize this? That is, how do we essentially prepare school programs for for our children in the future. We're talking about the European Union, where there is a common European school in teaching, and then it's a dream at this point. But it will have to be solved, because we don't live in an age anymore where we don't have the intellectual tools to do it, right? On this mass scale, it seems there to be a problem. But if you actually go study the various historiographies, you see that, we've had our competent people, keep having them. And the question there is maybe if they can be a bit more, they can be a bit more talkative to each other, for example, to have a bit more of a comprehensive view of the world, not such a hyper-specialistic one. Because if you look at the synthesis, if you lack the synthesis capability, you're going to fail with the rest, because you can't even be an expert on that most extremely specific topic. But what if you can't contextualize? You lack consistently the means, mental structures to contextualize in the broader picture, right? I've seen atrocious things. Once I asked a professor if he could tell me which sources to use about a city-state during the 14th century. I needed information for the first half of the 14th century. This person had the courage to answer me, well, I don't know, because, you should be knowing that I'm specialized in the second half of the 14th century. That is to say, you study a major political entity with dramatic documentations that, however, it's more or less some chronicles and other archive sources, but you can't tell me, right, even elementarily, what should I be looking for? I mean, you're freaking medievalist, and that's the same place and century you're specialized in, and you can't tell me even something so simple as what are the major sources historiographical. That's it. It's ridiculous. Like, if I wrote this in my PhD introduction, they would tell me what has this person done. But you find these people teaching around. So that is always my reminder that we don't have to be intimidated by, let's say, by authority, in the sense that we don't have to think that authority is always competent, right? We have to be humble enough to realize that before criticizing authority, we should be at least as competent as the authority, and history has showed us that that's how, by quality, by merit, the functional elites emerge and substitute the old ones. But for that matter, there is so much confusion. Right, so many times I get this question: what should I be reading for covering this topic more? What is the best book about this? The question is, go out there yourself. Like, start. I know that there can be a quick. I'm kind of contradicting myself, because I sound like the professor that didn't want to say which, because he didn't know. Evidently, I could tell you, because you could simply make a Google search and see what's this top. You buy that book, because there is, and you go look in the bibliography, you have everything you want. There is a universe that opens to you, so it's that easy, right? I believe most of this stuff can be found even just by connection from Wikipedia or archive.org. I mean, it's that easy. But a question like that suffers of the evident limit of thinking that of course that the knowledge and the capacity of accessing it is limited, that there is at least much less to know than you actually believe. And these are questions naturally come from the younger, because I remember that I thought a bit like that the same. How much do you want? I wish to know that there to be in the past. Well, there's a freaking much, right? Even about era, especially to say still about eras where sources are very few. Interpreting a source is not easy, right? But the question here is that the way you interpret that source is biased. That is to say, even the curiosity that is the sap of research, of inquiry, etc., is fundamentally deriving from subjective reasons, for personal bias, for an approach that will definitely mark your path at that point, but that will dilute, however, over time amidst this sea of information that you will find, that you will learn how to frame your own way, right? That is the positive, constructive part of history, that you can go out there and literally creating your own interpretation. Of course, it has to be based on evidence and facts, on actual something that is checkable and criticizable in turn, and that will be criticized, right? Because historiography can't sclerotize itself. But even in here, there's a balance, right? Because certain things, unless there will be a major catastrophe and we will lose all our data, all the stuff, we'll have to start from scratch. But what has been written historiographically, even if people can forget about that over time, is still there, right? And we have the mean of preserving it and rendering ever more accessible. Digitalization has been dramatic, right? Writing today, there are works that 30 years ago would have been unthinkable simply because of the sheer amount of time that still working on with certain specific means would have rendered impossible, right? I made a work this here. I don't know how many quotes there are. There's something like possibly 20,000. Think about doing that in written form, in handwriting. We would have done that in the time I did it, of course. So we are literally pushing through a completely different into a completely different scenario that still leaves a lot of work to do, but of course of room and for experimentation and so on. So politics, in this regard, is given this enormous amount of possibilities. What is the direction you want to take? And having a political culture is definitely useful, right? Having a political culture doesn't mean to me that you have to look at the classical political spectrum that at the end of the day is still valid, right? I believe many people say there's no right wing or left wing. To me, they're all there, and they're even ever more evident simply because sometimes their messages are ever simpler. They are kind of becoming more primitive in a sense. This is a consequence of the too quick elevation of the masses from a state basically of nothingness, if not just in terms of labor force, to literacy and and kind of amount of wealth. But at a time where, in fact, political struggles were more evident, because if up to a certain time ago, right, there were simply a chunk of the population who couldn't vote, or that didn't have certain specific rights, or wasn't represented just in terms of their work rights, for example, etc. There you had definitely even certain what we would call radical extremistic movements had a sense. Right. When you look at communism, and we're all aware that it's basically the political ideology that caused, directly or indirectly, the greatest amount of killings in the history of mankind, and together with national socialism and fascism, should be one of those things for which every single human being on earth should wake up and feel ashamed for himself, like even if it has nothing to do with that, because of just belonging to the human race. You can see, however, that in the simplicity of the thought, that it had, of course, nothing to do with even going remotely close to understanding communist theory or Marxism, knowing how to read Marx or Lenin and so on. It's obvious that a worker, I don't know, in the first half of the 20th century would be sucked into, I don't know, a communist, in the Communist Party, right? Because their living conditions at the time sucked so badly, and for evidently unjust reasons, that maybe communism was not the answer, but it was such a rough reality that kind of extreme position would have been taken. Today, such positions are stupid, to say the least, because they do not bring any social peace. They do not get anything constructive. They do not confrontate with reality. They're utopias that mismatch completely with the problems that we're facing at this point, and may be still connected to, of course, a certain type of culture rather than another. You're more, I don't know, if you're more leaning more right or left, it depends. Those parameters do remain. But the question is it worth, as we were saying before, to literally choose, like, I have to be either this or that? that party, that ideology, that doctrine, right? Or can I be super partes? I can be over all this stuff and simply judging at a given moment what reality is by simply studying that reality and not giving a damn about those ideologies. This is the political message I'm conveying. That is not an anti-political one, but it is essentially stripping politics of the idea that it has to be something sectarian, right? That it has to be either, if you're not of ours, you are the bad guy. You're the one that has to be emarginated. That has to suffer. And say, no, you can't be an independent. You can't be a free thinker. You can be more or less oriented, but you will remain so as long as, in fact, you don't buy in this kind of communitaristic approach of you are part of the group or you're not part of the group. We're all part of groups. We all feel for those groups. We all have a passion. We all have a feeling, sometimes negative ones, such as resentment. But the problem is not solved by fueling that hate. Is about solving the problem, right? And you can use violence to solve the problem, because all politics is violent in a way. But the question is also how to use violence, right? What do you think we talk about von Clausewitz in strategic culture? Because at the end of the day, studying these things has to do with realizing how to be more responsible in terms of the exercise of violence. We made a video recently. It was discussing essentially what happened last summer in the United States. All the riots, the government's response, etc., and essentially observing how important it is to calibrate even just a word, right? When it comes to be such an important scale, certain threats or certain, from both sides, right? What is that you have to? Is violence useful? I've read randomly, incidentally, on a blog where it was the other day, that people still make questions, right? In a world like this, where such things have happened, where such problems have come so prominently on the fore, not just because of what happened last year, but about international thing. I mean, but it was a coup in Myanmar the other day. Still major threat. Nuclear weapons arming. The various wars you can imagine being fought. Actually, if nobody actually cares out there, still having major blogs posing questions as plain, as superficial, as simplistic as, is violence useful? That is to say, haven't you ever studied history? Like, haven't you ever realized that that great part of the history of mankind, of civilization, revolves around the necessity of using violence, when to use it, and there is all this problem of calibrating it, of exactly building a strategic culture, that is to say, realizing how you can employ that military instrument. That's a pretty good example of how low we have sunk. I mean, in popular culture, in mass culture, in terms of the extremely narrow boundaries of understanding of what reveals to ourselves every day as in terms of reality of the world as an obviously self-evident, macroscopically complex and complicated reality, where you obviously can't answer to a question, is essentially violence to be used or not. Violence is out there. You can use it, yes. When to use it, you are responsible for it. Why we talk about military history on this channel? It's because we want to show how violence is being used, when it worked, when it didn't work, and therefore developing through that a political culture, a political consciousness, because that's at the end of the day what the real world is about. And the Clausewitzian theory, if you wonder why we talk about it, it's fundamentally about this. The Trinity has to do with politics, war, and society. That's what the three things you have to look at every single moment. It is, you can't detach politics from the military or from society, and all these three from the others equally. I made a video that was strikingly recent. I think it was literally last year in spring, where I made or in winter, I don't remember, when I was still let's say wavering about this topic. I was saying, of course, everything is political. Every content here has to be understood in a sense as it has that range of the target, the aim, that purpose. But at the same time, you could try, I was making it a matter of historical reliability. I used to say, if you're out there for making overtly ideological, propagandistic content, chances are that, yeah, you're not going to sound very credible, right? But the question there is not being overt or not. The problem there is about the quality of your political intelligence, right? What actually triggers people is not the fact that there is an historical content political content or even bias out there. What triggers people is when that intelligence is fundamentally stupid. That is, you open such dramatic problems, such as of international policy, of wars, and so on, by simply making an analysis of 30 lines and then pretending that that's something meaningful that can help solve the situation, right? Most content you can come across in terms of media, on average, is fundamentally that level of simplicity, right? Remember when there was a war in Syria for years, the media's covering of that was just when there was a massacre of civilians, right? Someone gassed them, so the thing was big news, right? And then have you ever followed through the media the actual progress of the war in Syria? What were the factions involved, what they were doing? If you didn't do that, you couldn't understand anything about why those civilians, for example, were massacred by whom. There was a huge debate about that. But if you had that political and progressed political and strategic culture, even maybe through the media information, you would have first seen that you would have known better because you would have already had better information at that point. But surely you would have been able to frame that news, not in the sensationalistic, emotionalistic, if you want, way, but fundamentally trying to literally understanding what the hell happened there, which is not easy to understand at all, right? Not even analysts are capable of doing it so readily, so quickly, so reliably, right? And that's how complex history really is. So bad news is that, yeah, if you don't have the time for carrying out those analyses, if you don't have a consistent, it was a parallel job, or maybe if you're lucky, if that's your job, that's another matter. But even in there, you see how hard it is. But the question is, yes, the average person won't have much of an insight of what the question that they should use to even start to try to understand that is. That is, leaving aside, of course, even starting the analysis. So I can tell you, I don't know, do you want me to talk about the war in Syria at some point? It would be interesting, right? I tell you, I'm not that expert. I've followed experts, I've read something, and I have some idea of that. That is something I could approach and understand in part just because I had some progressed historical background and military historical analysis, right? And of course, I'm no expert and I can't tell you too much, but yes, if this is more, it's more than what the average achieves, well, it can be useful, right? At the end of the day, that's also why I'm so vocal in this channel, why I uploaded all this content, because if that is more than what the average normally comes across, well, that can make an improvement. It's always almost a physical, mathematical realization, right? That depends of course on who watches and why and how. But the question is, of course, be always open to it. Things may be dramatically more complex than your own. So politically speaking, that brings you to pick a side, right? Because once you understand what happened about that massacre of civilians, well, first of all, you can't remain insensitive to it. You can't put it in relative terms. Yes, sure, right? For that, maybe there were 100 more people that were being killed that very day all over the world through different dynamics, but you can't as an innocent, you can't contextualize it in different ways, and that teaches you to have that sensitivity, that realizing that a human life is still a human life, but there is a way, people are killed, for example, that it's different from others, that entail different responsibilities, that also different degrees of predictability or even avoidability. Think about artificial intelligence. I mean, the use of drones and collateral damage. Many people complain about that without knowing that actually collateral damage has sunk, right? Even thanks to the use of drones. So the question, compared to, let's say, more, let's call it traditional ways of bombing, right? But if you've ever met, for example, somebody who told you otherwise, there you have found somebody that for some reason that is political, because maybe it has to do with against those who bomb, right? It's typical, right? Let's be honest that kind of the world has still not recovered from the Cold War mentality, in a sense. That there is a bunch of world that is pro-American and other is anti-American, and there is still a lot of dialectic revolving around that. I think it's pretty funny, because it's not that it doesn't matter, of course, but it's still superficial to reason like that, right? It's still, there are so many layers to add to that, and the simplicity of that dichotomy is striking, and it's revealed day by day. I must tell you this, I've been touched recently, and I tell you, I open to you a bit more, because after this point, I trust you. I've been deeply touched by the relation I have with a person that I care more than I couldn't even tell you how much. And I was accused, let's say, of that was tough to hear from her, because honestly, I hope I made her change her mind at some point. But the question, she told me, that history will always be more important for you, she was entailing, than me, right? And that wasn't true. I of course, I reassured the person. I told her, no, it's not the case. And if you think so, it is because you may not see why I care for history. Because to me, history is not that thing detached from reality in which we live, in which I don't think my children one day could live, or where I want to build a future with a person I care about. It's all connected to that, and therefore, when I make a correction, when I pose myself sometimes arrogantly, because I'm an ambitious person, even if I don't sound much so, but I have, believe me, I'm not very nice. I'm nice with you because you respond positively, so I presume it's fine, right? What I say is meaningful to you at the point you at least think about it, even if you disagree, right? So I don't care about if you disagree with me. I'm fine with you. I actually respect you because you have exactly that predisposition that brings you to say, okay, well, let's talk about it. That I disagree with you, but I tell you, and I would like to understand more about your point of view and me about your own. But the point is that this touches us at levels you wouldn't expect. Like the idea that you look at a society, you look at an individual commitment, you look at having a job, carrying out a certain activity, sometimes is deeply connected to our same vision of the world through history and through politics in that sense, right? Through politics is obvious because, turns out that most people, like when they talk, we know that when we talk about politics as primitive apes, there's literally one part of our frontal cortex that shuts down, right? And that is serious. That is, doesn't matter how intelligent you are. When you touch politics, you go gorilla style, right? And because we're meant to work like that, like in nature, in the wild, we have evolved like that. right? But we can do better. So it's that easy to fall into this trap. It's so easy to be, for example, an intelligent, educated, competent person in your own field, and then you talk about another where you tend to compensate for that ignorance with your bias, and you go wild because you're not consistent at all, and you're triggered by that. So talking about politics is not easy, right? But it's obvious that it's out there. It's obvious that when we talk about politics, there is in fact something in our mind that is immediately triggered. We feel that sense of, say, discomfort slash, aggressiveness that immediately comes in, because it's like, we have to fight. We're the group. We have to fight against the other. We have to get ready for that, right? Then our reality doesn't work, fortunately, much like that anymore. And because we have work to fix it in that matter. But if we could be able to, for an instant, to look at politics and strip away all the colors, all the bias, all the all the heated feelings, and just to look at politics for the science that it is, like not a perfect science. I mean, science as you could think of it, social science specifically. You would see there all where this permeates, and you would understand that at that point, when you go feel it again, it makes a hell of an impact to feel it like that. Whereas when we think of it, we mostly our mind mostly flashes us paradigmatically as thinking that there are these universal predispositions of color, side of faction, whatever, that define us, and we have just to follow that. No, we have the capacity of giving it a value specifically and building it in our own way. This is the constructive way of looking at politics, and history teaches you this brutally, because it doesn't give a damn about what you think. And that's when you meet the most ideologized people out there, you realize that they bend history to their own purpose. That is, they don't make history. They just have a narrative that is wrong, they don't even care to challenge, because they have heard it somewhere, they got fascinated with it, infatuated with it for some reason. And they can't see anymore. And instead, even just in interpersonal relationships, sometimes if we could only see that there is something more, right? There is something better we can do. That we should believe firmly that every person can be a better person, right? This is difficult to say, because when you're confronted with terrorists or with serial killers, maniacs, criminals of various sort, you have there the sensation of, that is hard. That is to say, no, we just have to get rid of these elements abruptly, even violently sometimes, even putting them to death. Of course, if there is a threat, like, pick a terrorist who's shooting people, shoot him down. There's no problem there, morally speaking, as far as I'm concerned. But when the thing has happened, this has, I'm sorry, sometimes I go look documentaries of, the death row, convicts, or, serial killers. I do. I'm one of those many people, if it is pretty large groups of people who like watching documentaries about serial killers, criminal psychology inquiries. It's very fascinating, because that shows you actually how, aside from the moralistic point of view, that you can still say, I don't give a damn about them, but how the mind works, how human mind is flexible, how it's false to believe that that person is just like that and can't change. There is in fact this effect that we also talked about that can be extended to Fukuyama's view of the world. Allegedly, after the Cold War, everything would have been fine, all happy and Western and so on. But it's the end of a history illusion, right? It's the idea that the world would more or less won't change. Even in your life, you as a person, you're more or less the same. Nothing will happen. Yeah, there will be changes, but you don't even suspect how quickly you will change eventually for things that you haven't thought of, and how, however, you have essentially, for laziness, for attrition, you have convinced yourself, your brain, that you will actually not change, right? And this is interesting because at the end of the day, it's a kind of a cognitive dissonance. That is to say, we're confronted every single day with a reality that changes unexpectedly. And still, we don't seem to fix that, cope with that very much. You know why? Because our neurological system hasn't developed, evolutionarily speaking, so fast as our society. Our society is artificial. Most of our values, of our of those core concepts, are constructs that we have been forced to believe in order to cope with a reality. It was too complex at the moment for our capacities of of a society to cope with that functionally, and therefore we can't find peace sometimes. We give negative answers. We give up essentially the chance of doing that better, and instead we're underestimating ourselves. Right, a person who fixates on certain concepts or certain ideas is underestimating himself. Is a person that needs to be showed. Why is that? It needs to be educated in the Latin sense, etymologically speaking, of the term. It is to be led out of that. That is Kant, by the way, because it's the definition of the Enlightenment. It's this obscurity that is we pose ourselves. We pose on ourselves, right? And that we are the first responsible for letting ourselves to miserably be in. Instead, we can come to the light, and we can do it much more easily than it seems. And I think history here is the best medicine, right? Surely the best medicine is medicine, right, as always. But don't think that in that regard, we couldn't do better socially, politically, if we knew history. I'm firmly convinced, it may be a professional bias, but the idea is that if we all knew history, we would be much better persons, we would be much better communities, we would live in a much better world altogether. And we're gradually starting to do that. Of course, people know much more about history today than it was known in the past, right? In the past, we knew other things. We knew perhaps better things at some level, but they were still functional to another reality. This is different now, and we're struggling to find the new stuff, right? So politics means sometimes something hard, that is to raise your hand and to complain, to say, I don't like this, I don't want it. You may be wrong, right? We are easily wrong. We're all a bit wrong. At least. But and we are very wrong, actually, most of the times. But the question in this sense is, what are you going to do about it? Are you taking your own responsibility and realize that that entails your commitment out there in a way or another, right? It may sound romantic, or and it's surely more complex than that. But why do you think, for example, I make all these videos? Because I don't know, honestly. But when I think about that reason, when I think about the fact that history can't really help people out there, that I'm not here making, I don't know, with all respect for other, I'm not making recipes out here. I'm not making, surely I love to eat. I love it, I have a consistent, I absolutely can't cook, telling the truth, but I have my own taste. Once I gifted my ex with a I don't know, I was like 20 volumes of recipes for various cuisines, because I planned to now I will be accused of sexism or other stuff, but I must say I can be crazy like that sometimes. It's selfish like that, but I truly mean here this is a way to redeem myself, right? That we all do stupid things at some level. Independently from the example just threw in, but I mean truly that history is the medicine, because history frees you from those preconceptions. It does it by an injury, not for ideological, broader, moralistic reasons. No, because those fall, right? It's because when you have to find a pattern interpretation that you've never even thought before during your life. Your mind expands. You acquired a new tool of understanding. You frame things that you've never done, so you have surpassed yourself. Your former self. I was thinking yesterday at, how I was just, I don't know, 5 years ago. And I said, at the time I liked myself. I had this time to say, I always said, am I doing well? Am I kind of a good person? I realized, I don't know, 5 years ago, the ideas I had, it's not a long time ago, right? The ideas I had were worse, right? The person I was less disciplined, I was less controlled, I was less intelligent. What did help me a lot? It was mostly history, right? It's true that it's almost basically what I've done all throughout these years, but at the same time, I realized that it did it probably better than if I had simply done, something else, especially something that wasn't coping with something so complex, even just from a conceptual methodological point of view, because at the end of the day, when you have to make a research, you can't say, well, okay, today I'll just read that, then the work will write it by itself. You have to make a research proper. That is, you have to invent yourself. What would you have come up at years of distance by a massive amount of work, looking at an enormous amount of sources, and say about which you don't know anything yet, or barely. And that is a challenge. That stresses you out, but it still pressures you in a way that you can come up with a better of yourself. And that is also the sad news, right? That these, or maybe it's the good news, where it is the happy news, is that doesn't come but through effort, right? It doesn't come but through a great commitment, an imposing amount of work. That is, I presume, what life is about at the end of the day. As long as you do it, of course, for what you like, proper. That is, of course, being obliged to do something you don't want is not good, right? We all do, right? But when you have the possibility of making a difference yourself, even if life brings you down, do not leave it untried, right? Take the chance, have that courage, even if it costs, even if, but it's a hope. After all, what do we go on for at the end of the day? It's the hope of making it better. It's the hope of having our own, even personal achievement, in a sense, that doesn't have to be broader humanistic feeling, philanthropic feeling, but indirectly is, because you are playing on your humanity at that point. You're allowing yourself to be a better person every day, even if it's hard, right? It goes at different rates of speed. It requires resources, moral and material alike. So it's not an easy journey, but at that point, what are we living for if we don't take the chance? There could be better words maybe to phrase this, but it gets down to that responsibility. It gets down to the acknowledgement that whatever you do makes a difference in the world. I would say that's the simplest thought from which to start, right? It develops, if you want, in the planning, in the before. Sometimes it's just a dream, right? It's something we spend consistently more time hoping for that, thinking that we can do it, rather than actually doing it. But the more you think at the possibility of doing something better, the more you enjoy, you like, the more you think, I want to do it. I think I deserve to have that shot. And history is a bit like this. History is probably even more meaningful, because you literally ask yourself, but what is really making me do this? That is, do I actually like all those swords? Do I actually care? Right? It can fascinate me when I know them, and then of course they became part of my life. They structure the person I am. They make me think in ways I'd never before. But is it because I actually care about that specific note? It's because I care about that specific fight or whatever. It's not really about that. It's really about the fact that through that we understand better our human self, and therefore we can cope more effectively with each other to for mutual benefit, right? Um, and yes, this is the realization I came to. So if you had asked me this 1 year ago, I would have simply told you, well, thinking politically in history, maybe it's not really a great deal. Yes, I still believe that. I still believe it's not a great idea to go out there with a bias, and but with a bias can be channeled to help understand better the thing. So at some point you will be guided by that, but at the same time you will and you will realize you can't do really without that everything you say by approximation, even by mistake, becomes political, because it's gonna remain biased, but still it will be ever less so, right? It will bring you more distant than what you believed, and it could be possible. This is a very empowering thought thinking, right? At some it could be harsh to hear this. I don't know, because I'm relatively young. I actually see myself the many better things I could have done in my past. I think we all agree on that, right? We all could have made a better choice at some point. But in the moment in which you realize that through that failure is what you have actually improved, through that same realization that you can do better, in fact, it makes you realize that there are different paths to reach the same goal. That at the end of the day, it all depends on the motivation that you have. And not just, it's also means, of course, but it's an improvement that you can measure if you want every day, that you can substantially count factually, right, that will improve your life. So yeah, and it's never too late, I presume. It's never there's never a moment in which you can't give up. I know many people give up because at the end of the day, we don't want to be told we have to make an effort to feel better, and that's instead most of what is required to us. And that when you're disillusioned, you start thinking that after all, the world is always the same. What can I do to change it? Nothing. It's useless. I am useless. But that's not good. Now, even just psychologically speaking, we are told, we know that comes from being hurt, from having not resolved certain problems we've had. And the reason why we have not resolved them is most of the cases because we didn't want to. Not because it wasn't possible, because it was even so difficult, but because in a way maybe we got habituated on even venting ourselves through through those feelings too. But it's involutive. It's something that makes us remain where we are. Becoming a better person, feeling better about ourselves, does pass through that, and mostly through that. Because whatever we do, we actually go through that process. Whatever accomplishment, whatever effort we make, it's for some reason. And we see that the reason at the end of the day is for feeling better. Unless we have some dramatic problem, it can be pathological, that is really serious, and that where we have other people that can help us at the same time, that provide support, figure about medicine and all the improvements that we have searched for each other, for ourselves. But normally, the world does suffer from the lack of acknowledging our potential, right? And don't throw away politics in that sense. Don't think that even if you remain in the shade, you're not going to be a politician, you're not being, too much out there and so on. What you personally do makes a great difference, right? And Just thinking that is not enough. You have to literally do it. Otherwise, you will keep complaining. You will keep thinking at the end of the day wasn't feasible, or you know, you forget about that. Instead, you have to get used to the idea you can measure that improvement. And until you don't have the courage to challenge your own self, that can't come about. It's I don't know. Well, I presume there is some important idea in that there's some important value in this, that when it's grasped, and that's sometimes the greatest problem, that until we don't do it, if nobody shows us, we tend to remain stuck. That's why history is important. That's why dialogue, confronting with other people, is important, because it may not be pleasant at some point, but it still makes us think. It still widens our horizon. So staying open is not a state of mind. There are many people who claim, I'm such an open-minded person. That seems to be fashionable. I'm an open-minded person. How can you present yourself to somebody and say, I'm an open-minded person? As if, there was a standard open-minded person versus the closed-minded. That's how stupid certain political positions are. Why? Because that person is not open-minded at all. It's just shouting that, look at me, I'm the good one, right? And then what have you actually done to deserve to be deemed open-minded? A very few. Until you challenge, and that it becomes difficult. There are many. The more you know it, and the more you feel challenged in that sense. It's not easy, but surprisingly, or maybe not so much, that's exactly what makes you a better person. Because in the moment in which you start wondering whether you're doing something good or not, well, chances are those are the moments you're going to do better at the end of the day, just because of having realized that could make an important difference. Most people just stop, but I'm talking even, this is nothing to do, like being older, for example, that has nothing to do with age. There are people who remain like that for a lifetime because literally nobody has told them to do different. Couldn't be wiser. Wisdom is something that is a bit more difficult to be told, but I presume that wisdom and intelligence, by two very different things, are connected. They're more closely connected than it seems, right? Because at the end of the day, intelligence can't be there if you're not used to make it work. That is, to try, sometimes to fail, and to feel the what can bring you to the mistake. They're just different fields in that sense. That is, I don't know, a person who has studied much, for example, has not had much of a social interaction, can be, for example, very intelligent in his own field, but maybe sucks at relationships, right? Just guessing. And I'm saying it because I'm experienced the same thing, honestly. But when I'm exposed to this, I know I can be better, and having understood that, like, this made me hopefully more intelligent, but also wiser, because it's not just a cognitive problem. That may help me to cope partially with it, but the feelings I have, that those can really make a great difference for future life experiences, and it's not so immediate, it's not so easy, to change like that. You don't have to give it for granted. But anyhow, for now, I think we stop here, because when I make these videos, I think I touch always the same topics at the end of the day. When I talk so much out here, it's also obvious that I go circles sometimes. But I believe these are important things. At least they have been for me, so I feel the need to communicate them to you as a as a perspective. And of course, for all those who have just joined, just to give a bit more of join here, subscribe, to give a bit more of a parameter to evaluate this channel, to judge even, because once again, the historical content I put out there is easily weaponizable. Let's use it in this way, right? There are certain statements, certain acknowledgments that can be easily twisted, can be easily misunderstood, can be easily equivocated, and I see it every day, right? So I can do better, but at the same time I can explain myself, in fact, for allowing others not to give it a too superficial look, and to see that this is the challenge we're all confronted by. It doesn't matter where we come from, what experience we had. There is a universal language that is difficult to be found, but at the end of the day, we all work like that. And I feel much for this. I believe that humans have an innate common capacity of achieving incredible stuff. So that I find a terrific field of investment. If we can improve that pattern on that line, we can't really make the world a better place, right? I hope. Anyhow, for now I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.